Most people in the station never noticed the lonely girl with silver hair until the day the most powerful woman in the outer systems came looking for the human who shared his lunch with her. The orbital station Helios 9 smelled like burnt copper, recycled rainwater, and overheated reactor coils. Every few seconds, the massive docking rings outside the transparent dome groaned as cargo freighters latched onto the station's magnetic ports. Caleb Mercer barely noticed anymore. After 6 years working maintenance on Helios 9, the noise had become part of his heartbeat. He sat alone on a narrow steel catwalk nearly 300 feet above the lower transit lanes, his boots hanging over the edge while transport shuttles drifted beneath him like glowing insects trapped inside glass. The heat from a nearby ventilation unit washed over his worn charcoal jacket as he opened the small metal lunchbox resting on his knee. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, cheap protein bar. Same thing almost every day. Across the station, holographic advertisements shimmered through the hazy air, painting the industrial walls in shifting shades of blue and gold. Most workers ate in the crowded cafeteria below, but Caleb preferred the catwalks. Fewer people, less noise, less pretending. He took a bite of his sandwich while checking the diagnostics display attached to his wrist pad. Reactor temperatures on deck C were climbing again. Probably another cracked coolant valve. Nothing on Helios 9 ever stayed fixed for long. A sharp burst of laughter echoed from the transit platform beneath him. Caleb glanced down just in time to see a group of academy students walking through the station corridor in polished uniforms trimmed with silver thread. Rich kids from the upper districts. They moved through the station like they owned the air inside it. Most never looked at the workers keeping the place alive. But one figure lingered behind the others. A girl. Turquoise skin almost glowing beneath the cold overhead lights. Long silver-white hair falling over the collar of her dark academy coat. She stood completely still beside a vending terminal while the crowd flowed around her like water around stone. Caleb noticed something strange immediately. Nobody stood near her, not even by accident. Travelers shifted directions without realizing it. Students lowered their voices when they passed. One young man started toward the terminal beside her, froze mid-step after recognizing her face, then quietly turned around. The girl didn't react. She simply stared at the food display behind the scratched vending glass with distant violet eyes that looked exhausted in a way Caleb recognized too well. He watched her for another moment before muttering under his breath, "That's one hell of a lonely look." The station lights dimmed briefly as another cargo liner connected to the outer ring. A low vibration rolled through the catwalk beneath him. Down below, the girl checked something on a slim datapad, then reached into her coat pocket. Her expression tightened slightly. Empty. She stood there for several more seconds before stepping away from the vending terminal without buying anything. Caleb frowned. He looked down at the second half of his sandwich resting inside the lunchbox. Then back at her. Logic told him to ignore it. Everybody on Helios 9 minded their own business. That was how you survived stations like this. But the memory of those tired violet eyes stayed with him. Before he could talk himself out of it, Caleb stood, grabbed his lunchbox, and headed for the maintenance ladder. The steel rungs clanged softly beneath his boots as he descended toward the transit level. By the time he reached the corridor, the girl had already moved toward the massive observation windows overlooking the stars. She stood there alone beneath the pale station lights, her reflection faint against the endless black beyond the glass. Caleb slowed as he approached her. Up close, she looked younger than he expected. Maybe 19, maybe 20. There was something careful about the way she held herself, like someone used to people watching every move she made. She noticed him instantly. Her posture stiffened. Caleb lifted the lunchbox slightly. "You hungry?" For a second, genuine surprise crossed her face. Not fear, not arrogance, just confusion. Like nobody had asked her something that simple in a very long time. The station lights hummed softly overhead while distant cargo alarms echoed through the transit corridor like mechanical whale calls drifting through deep water. Caleb stood there holding his scratched metal lunchbox, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he probably looked. Workers did not usually walk up to academy girls in polished uniforms offering half a sandwich, especially not girls who carried themselves like they belonged somewhere far above Helios 9's maintenance decks. The turquoise-skinned girl studied him carefully, her silver-white hair reflecting faint blue light from the observation window behind her. Up close, her eyes were even stranger than he first realized. Violet with tiny silver flecks scattered through the irises like frozen stars. Intelligent eyes. Tired eyes. "You are speaking to me?" she asked quietly. Her voice carried a soft melodic accent Caleb could not place. "Last time I checked." Caleb lifted the lunchbox slightly. "Turkey sandwich. Nothing fancy, but it is real turkey, which already makes it better than 90% of station food." For a second, the corner of her mouth twitched as though she almost smiled. Almost. Then the expression vanished behind caution again. "I cannot accept charity." Caleb leaned one shoulder against the wall beside the observation glass. "Good thing I am not offering charity." She blinked once. "Then what are you offering?" "Lunch." He opened the box and held it toward her. Big difference. The girl stared down at the sandwich without moving. Around them, travelers continued passing through the corridor, though Caleb noticed several people glancing nervously in their direction before quickly looking away again. Strange. Usually station workers loved staring at attractive academy students. But nobody seemed willing to look at this girl for more than half a second. Caleb ignored it. "You always carry enough food for strangers?" she asked. "Only the hungry ones." That earned him another almost smile. Smaller this time. Sadder somehow. She looked back toward the stars beyond the glass dome. A massive freighter drifted silently past the station outside, its engines glowing pale, orange against the darkness. "You should eat your own meal," she said softly. "You work maintenance. Your job requires energy." Caleb snorted quietly. "You sound like my mother." Was she wise? The question caught him off guard. He rubbed the back of his neck before answering. Usually. Annoyingly. Silence settled between them for a moment. Not awkward silence. Just stillness. The kind Caleb rarely found anywhere on Helios 9. Somewhere below the transit level, a docking clamp slammed into place with a deep metallic boom that vibrated through the floor beneath their feet. The girl finally reached for the sandwich with careful movements, as though accepting something fragile. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome." She took a small bite. Then another. Caleb pretended not to notice how quickly the first half disappeared after that. He sat down on the bench beside the observation window and gestured toward the empty space next to him. "You can sit, you know." Her posture stiffened slightly again. "People generally prefer distance from me." "That sounds exhausting." "It is." Caleb shrugged. "Well, I already walked over here. Feels rude to leave now." To his surprise, she slowly sat beside him. Not close enough for their shoulders to touch, but close enough that he could hear the faint rustle of her dark academy coat each time she moved. The station lights reflected softly across her turquoise skin, giving her an almost unreal appearance against the blackness of space beyond the glass. "What is your name?" she asked after a while. "Caleb Mercer." He nodded toward her sandwich. "And you?" She hesitated long enough for him to notice. "Lyra. Just Lyra. For now." Caleb chuckled quietly. "Mysterious. I like it." That time, she actually smiled. Tiny, brief, but real. And somehow, in that endless station filled with machinery, noise, and cold artificial light, it felt like the warmest thing Caleb had seen in years. By the next station cycle, Caleb realized something unusual was happening. Helios 9 never truly slept. The station rotated through artificial daylight every 18 hours, but the noise never stopped. Cargo thrusters roared against docking clamps. Cooling. Fans hissed through ventilation shafts. Thousands of footsteps echoed endlessly across steel corridors polished smooth by generations of workers and travelers. Yet somehow, every time Caleb crossed the transit level near the observation dome, he found Lyra sitting in the exact same place beside the stars. And every time, nobody sat near her. Caleb noticed it more clearly now. People avoided her with the same quiet instinct animals used before a storm. Station guards glanced at her and immediately straightened their posture. Academy students lowered their eyes when they walked past. Even the arrogant merchant families from the upper rings suddenly became careful with their words around her. Caleb leaned against the vending terminal beside the observation windows while sipping stale station coffee from a paper cup. "All right," he muttered. "Either you secretly owe everybody money, or I accidentally made friends with a serial killer." Lyra looked up from the datapad resting in her lap. For a moment she appeared confused. Then she surprised him with a quiet laugh. Not loud, not polished, real. The sound almost disappeared beneath the distant hum of the station engines, but Caleb caught it anyway. I assure you, she said softly, I am neither of those things. Good. He sat beside her, balancing his coffee against one knee. Because I already shared my sandwich yesterday. Hard to take that back now. Her silver eyes lingered on him for a second longer than usual. You speak strangely for a maintenance worker. You speak strangely for a student. Perhaps we are both disappointing our professions. Caleb grinned faintly. Now that sounds like progress. Outside the massive dome, a long convoy freighter drifted past the station carrying hundreds of glowing cargo containers stacked in neat rows like floating city blocks. The reflected lights moved slowly across Lyra's turquoise skin, turning her almost luminous against the darkness. Caleb opened his lunchbox again. This time he had packed 2 sandwiches without thinking about it. He pretended not to notice when her eyes flicked briefly toward the food before returning to the stars. You know, he said casually, most people around here act like you are carrying a bomb. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly around her datapad. And yet you continue sitting beside me. Should I stop? That depends. Her voice became quieter. Do you care why they avoid me? Caleb considered the question honestly. The station air smelled faintly of ozone and machine oil, while distant announcements echoed overhead in 6 different languages. Somewhere down on the lower decks, someone cursed loudly at a malfunctioning loader drone. Ordinary station life continued around them. Not really, Caleb admitted. Everybody on Helios 9 is running from something. Lyra stared at him for several seconds after that. Caleb could almost see the conflict behind her eyes. Like she wanted to say something, but no longer trusted herself to begin. Before she could answer, 3 academy students rounded the corner near the observation corridor. The moment they noticed Lyra, all 3 immediately fell silent. One of them, a tall alien male wearing silver-trimmed formal robes, actually stopped walking altogether. His pale face tightened with visible tension. Then he lowered his head respectfully toward Lyra before guiding the others away without a word. Caleb watched them disappear into the crowd. Okay, he murmured slowly. That one definitely looked scared of you. Lyra looked back down at her datapad. Fear is easier for people than sincerity. Caleb frowned slightly at the sadness hidden beneath her calm expression. You are what, 19? Approximately. Nobody your age should sound that tired. For the first time since meeting her, Lyra's carefully controlled composure cracked just a little. Her eyes drifted toward the stars beyond the glass, reflecting entire galaxies inside them. You would be surprised, she whispered, how exhausting it becomes when nobody speaks to you like a person anymore. The artificial rain began just after station dusk. Tiny streams of recycled water slid across the massive glass dome above Helios 9, blurring the stars into streaks of silver light. The sound echoed softly through the observation corridor like distant static, mixing with the low vibration of the station. Reactors deep beneath the floor. Caleb always liked the rain cycles. They made the station feel less mechanical somehow, less like a machine pretending to be a city. He stepped out of the maintenance elevator carrying a grease-stained toolkit over one shoulder and immediately spotted Lyra sitting by the observation window again. Same dark academy coat. Same silver hair catching pale blue reflections from the passing ships outside. But tonight she looked different. Tired in a sharper way. Her posture was rigid, and a thin holographic display floated in front of her filled with lines of glowing alien text moving too quickly for Caleb to read. You look like somebody just declared war on your homework, he said while dropping onto the bench beside her. Lyra startled slightly before dismissing the hologram with a flick of her fingers. I did not hear you approach. That means you are distracted. Caleb leaned back against the wall and stretched his sore shoulders until his spine popped softly. Bad day. She hesitated. Complicated day. Those are usually the worst kind. Rainwater rolled down the curved glass overhead while a shuttle drifted silently beyond the dome, its engine lights glowing gold through the distorted streams. The corridor around them remained strangely empty despite the busy hour. Caleb noticed that now more than ever, entire crowds unconsciously chose different paths when they saw Lyra sitting there. She noticed too. She always noticed. Caleb opened his lunchbox and slid it toward her without comment. This time she accepted half the sandwich immediately. Progress. You know. he said. Most people usually wait at least a week before stealing my food. Lyra took a small bite before answering. Perhaps your defenses are weak. That explains the reactor leaks too. Another faint smile touched her lips. Caleb realized something important then. Lyra smiled differently than other people. Most smiles were automatic, social, temporary. Hers felt unfamiliar, like she had forgotten how and was slowly relearning. So, Caleb continued casually, what exactly do Academy students study all day anyway? Politics, galactic economics, interstellar, governance, military history. Caleb stared at her. You are telling me there are schools where people willingly study economics? Terrifying, I know. I repair coolant systems for a living, and somehow your life still sounds more stressful. Lyra lowered her gaze briefly, and for the first time Caleb noticed dark shadows beneath her silver eyes. Not physical exhaustion exactly. Emotional exhaustion. The kind that settled into a person slowly over years. It is not the studies that are difficult, she admitted quietly. Then what is? Outside the dome, lightning flickered silently within a distant ion storm swirling around the lower atmosphere of the planet below. Blue-white flashes illuminated the corridor in brief pulses. Lyra watched the storm instead of answering immediately. Everyone around me always wants something, she finally said. Approval, influence, access. They speak carefully. They calculate every word before saying it. Caleb frowned slightly. Sounds miserable. It is lonely. The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. No royal arrogance. No dramatic sadness. Just simple truth. Caleb rubbed a thumb against the edge of his paper coffee cup before speaking again. Well, for what it is worth, I mostly just want my maintenance shift to end without an air filtration unit exploding. A quiet laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Real laughter this time. Warm enough that Caleb found himself smiling too. The station lights dimmed briefly as another freighter connected to the outer ring. The rain intensified overhead, water racing across the dome in silver rivers. Lyra leaned back slowly against the bench beside him, her shoulders finally relaxing for the first time since he met her. You are very strange, Caleb Mercer, she murmured softly. Yeah, he replied while staring out at the blurred stars beyond the rain-covered glass. I get that a lot. Several minutes passed in comfortable silence after that. At some point, without either of them noticing exactly when, Lyra's head slowly tilted sideways until it rested lightly against his shoulder. Caleb glanced down in surprise. Her eyes were closed, breathing steady, asleep. For a moment he simply sat there beneath the artificial rain and humming station lights, afraid even moving might wake her. And somewhere deep inside his chest, something quietly ached when he realized this might have been the first time in years that someone had allowed themselves to feel safe beside her. The next morning, Helios 9 smelled like overheated wiring and fresh welding smoke. Maintenance crews flooded the lower transit sectors after a coolant surge knocked half the station climate systems offline during the night cycle. Sparks flashed behind open wall panels while loader drones rolled through the corridors carrying replacement parts the size of small cars. Caleb spent nearly 6 straight hours inside a reactor access shaft barely wide enough to turn around in. And by the time he climbed back onto the main transit level, his hands were stained black with grease and coolant residue. He looked exhausted. He also realized, somewhat annoyingly, that the first thing he thought about after his shift ended was whether Lyra would still be near the observation dome. That bothered him more than it should have. Caleb Mercer had spent years carefully building a life where nobody depended on him and he depended on nobody. It was simpler that way, cleaner. But somehow, over the course of a few lunches and quiet conversations beside the stars, that careful distance had started cracking apart without permission. He spotted her immediately. Lyra stood near the observation corridor speaking quietly with 2 Academy officials dressed in dark formal uniforms lined with silver markings. Both aliens were tall and rigid, their posture painfully formal. The moment Caleb approached, the 2 officials abruptly lowered their voices. One of them glanced toward Caleb with open alarm before stepping backward. Not nervousness. Alarm. Caleb slowed slightly. Weird. The taller official leaned toward Lyra one final time. You should not continue this, he whispered urgently. Caleb only caught part of it because of the corridor noise. Lyra's expression cooled instantly. That will be all. The two officials exchanged tense looks before leaving without another word. Caleb watched them disappear into the station crowd. Either I walked into a secret meeting, he said casually, or I owe somebody money again. Lyra looked tired. More tired than yesterday. You overheard nothing important. Usually when people say that, something important is definitely happening. She almost smiled at that, but the expression faded quickly. Caleb noticed her left sleeve had shifted slightly near the wrist. Beneath the dark fabric, a thin silver marking glimmered faintly against her turquoise skin. Circular lines intertwined around a symbol shaped almost like a crown surrounded by stars. Intricate, elegant, definitely not decorative. Caleb frowned. That looks expensive. Lyra immediately pulled the sleeve back down. Too quickly. It is nothing. Before Caleb could respond, movement across the corridor caught his attention. A pair of station security officers had stopped near the transit gate. Both were staring directly at Lyra. One officer noticed the silver mark before his face visibly drained of color. The older guard instantly lowered his head and pulled his younger partner away without speaking. Caleb blinked slowly. Okay, he muttered. Now I know something weird is going on. Lyra looked away toward the rain-streaked observation dome overhead. Artificial daylight reflected softly across her silver hair, while transport ships drifted beyond the glass like glowing ghosts. You should probably stop speaking with me, Caleb. The sentence landed harder than he expected. Why? Because eventually someone important will notice. Caleb laughed quietly. Pretty sure that already happened. I am serious. Her voice lowered. People around me create complications. Expectations. Consequences. Caleb leaned back against the wall beside her. You know what I think? What? I think you spend way too much time around people who talk like politicians. That finally pulled a real smile from her again. Small, but genuine. Caleb pointed toward it immediately. There. That. You should do that more often. Lyra shook her head softly, though amusement flickered briefly in her silver eyes. You are impossible. That is what my supervisor keeps writing in my evaluations. A shuttle roared. Passed outside the observation dome, its engines casting waves of gold light through the corridor. Lyra studied Caleb quietly for several seconds after that, like she was trying to understand something that did not fit inside the world she knew. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. Why are you not afraid of me? Caleb thought about the question honestly. Around them, station life continued in endless motion. Cargo drones buzzed overhead. Transit announcements echoed through the steel corridors. Somewhere below, machinery thundered like distant storms. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people. Yet somehow the space beside Lyra always felt strangely still. Caleb shrugged lightly. Because lonely people are usually not dangerous. For the first time since meeting her, Lyra looked genuinely stunned. The upper dining hall of Helios 9 looked less like a cafeteria and more like a museum pretending to serve food. Soft golden lights glowed beneath crystal ceiling panels, while quiet instrumental music drifted through the air almost too gently to notice. Polished tables curved along the panoramic windows overlooking the station's central docking ring, where luxury vessels floated like silver palaces against the stars. Caleb hated the place immediately. I still do not understand why you agreed to come here, Lyra said, while walking beside him through the entrance corridor. Because apparently one sandwich was enough for you to decide I needed a social life. Lyra lowered her eyes briefly, hiding a faint smile. You make that sound tragic. I work maintenance on a station held together with duct tape and prayers. Everything in my life is tragic. A hostess near the entrance froze the moment she recognized Lyra. The woman's face tightened with visible panic before she immediately bowed her head. Lady VA. Lyra stopped her with a single look. Calm. Silent. Immediate. The hostess swallowed hard and quickly stepped aside without finishing the sentence. Caleb caught it anyway. His brow furrowed slightly, but before he could ask, Lyra guided him toward a quiet table near the observation windows. Every person in the dining hall noticed them. Caleb realized that within seconds. Conversations lowered. Silverware paused. Wealthy merchants and academy officials glanced toward Lyra with the same nervous caution he had been seeing for days now. Yet somehow the strangest part was not the fear. It was the confusion on their faces while watching Caleb sit across from her like none of it mattered. A server arrived almost instantly carrying menus with trembling hands. Would you care for the imported solar eel, lady? Again, Lyra interrupted gently. Tea is sufficient. The server nodded too quickly and hurried away. Caleb leaned back in his chair once they were alone again. Okay, I officially feel underdressed. Lyra glanced toward his worn work jacket, still smudged with coolant stains. You are. Appreciate the honesty. Outside the massive window behind her, hundreds of station lights reflected across the dark hull of a passing diplomatic cruiser. The glow painted silver across Lyra's hair, while the soft music drifted around them like distant rain. Caleb noticed something strange then. For the first time since meeting her, Lyra looked uncomfortable. Not cold, not distant, uncertain. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the table as though she wanted to say something difficult. Caleb, she began quietly, why did you really approach me that first day? Because you looked hungry. No, she shook her head softly. I mean, why continue afterward? Caleb blinked once. That is the question? Please. There was something painfully sincere in her voice now. Caleb leaned back slightly, thinking about it. Around them, expensive dishes clinked softly while distant docking announcements echoed through the station beyond the elegant walls. All right, he said finally. First day, I thought you looked lonely. Second day, I realized you actually were. Lyra looked down at the table. Most people speak to me because they want access to something. What do I get access to? He asked lightly. She gave a humorless little smile. Exactly. Caleb rested his arms against the table. Lyra, I spent 10 years around military officers during the border conflicts. I know what fake conversations sound like. With you, none of this feels fake. Her silver eyes lifted slowly toward his. There was vulnerability there now. Barely visible, but real. You truly expect nothing from me? Caleb shrugged. Maybe decent conversation. Better station coffee recommendations. Emotional support when coolant pipes explode. A soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it, but this time the sound broke halfway through. Caleb frowned slightly. Hey. Lyra quickly looked away toward the stars outside the glass. Her voice lowered almost to a whisper. Do you know what the worst part of power is? Paperwork. Isolation. The single word carried more exhaustion than anything else she had ever said. Caleb watched her quietly for a moment before answering. Then maybe you should spend less time around people who worship you. Lyra closed her eyes briefly at that. When she opened them again, they looked dangerously close to tears she clearly refused to let fall. I shared lunch because you looked lonely, Caleb said softly. That is all. Silence settled between them after that. Not empty silence. Heavy silence. The kind that changed something permanent without either person fully realizing it yet. And for the first time since arriving on Helios 9, Lyra Vale looked at someone across the table and believed him. 3 days later, Caleb realized people had started watching him. Not casually. Not the normal curious looks workers got when they accidentally wandered into upper station politics. This felt different. Intentional. The realization hit him during second shift maintenance near docking ring 7, while he balanced halfway, inside an open coolant shaft with a plasma wrench clenched between his teeth. Every time he climbed out to check diagnostics, the same 2 security officers stood somewhere nearby, pretending not to stare. One near the cargo lift. One beside the transit checkpoint. Different uniforms than station security too. Dark silver armor with no visible insignia. Professional posture. Quiet eyes. Caleb muttered under his breath while tightening a pressure seal. Either I accidentally joined a cult, or somebody really cares about maintenance reports. The coolant pipe hissed sharply as freezing vapor burst across his gloves. He finished the repair, wiped sweat from his forehead, and climbed back onto the catwalk overlooking the docking bay. The moment he did, one of the silver-armored officers touched 2 fingers to an earpiece and quietly walked away. Caleb frowned. Yeah, definitely being watched. By the time his shift ended 6 hours later, the station had entered artificial night cycle. The overhead lights dimmed into softer blue tones, while most commercial traffic slowed to a low mechanical hum. Helios 9 looked almost peaceful at night. Almost. Caleb grabbed a paper cup of terrible vending machine coffee and headed toward the observation corridor out of habit more than intention. He found Lyra sitting beneath the massive dome exactly where she always sat, silver hair glowing softly beneath the pale station lights. But tonight she was not alone. For silver-armored guards stood several yards away pretending to study the corridor while carefully monitoring everyone who passed. None of them looked relaxed. Caleb stopped beside the bench. "Okay," he said slowly. "I need you to explain why your study group suddenly looks ready to invade a small planet." Lyra looked genuinely embarrassed. "They are precautionary." "Against what?" "Possibilities." Caleb stared at her. "That is the most rich person answer I have ever heard." One of the guards glanced sharply toward Caleb before immediately looking away again. Lyra noticed it too. Her shoulders tightened slightly. "You should probably stop coming here for a while," she said quietly. "There it is again." Caleb sat beside her anyway. "Everybody keeps telling me that." "Because they are correct." "You know," he said while sipping his coffee, "when people say things like that without explanations, it just makes me more curious." The artificial stars projected across the upper station ceiling flickered softly above them, while distant docking alarms echoed through the corridor. Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the glass dome ahead. "There are expectations attached to people like me. You still have not told me what kind of people you mean." "Dangerous people." Caleb considered that for a second before shrugging lightly. "You still look lonely to me." Lyra turned toward him then, and for the first time since meeting her, real frustration flashed across her face. "Why are you making this difficult?" "Because I do not understand what I am supposed to be afraid of." "My world," she whispered. Silence settled heavily between them after that. Beyond the dome, an enormous diplomatic cruiser drifted slowly past the station, its silver hull reflecting thousands of stars across the observation corridor. Caleb studied Lyra carefully. The exhaustion in her eyes had deepened over the past few days. So had something else. Fear. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. That realization landed quietly in Caleb's chest. "Hey," he said softer this time. "Did somebody threaten you?" "No. Did somebody threaten me?" Lyra hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Seriously? You do not understand how people like my family operate. Then explain it." Her silver eyes lowered toward the untouched sandwich resting beside her on the bench. Caleb noticed she had barely eaten lately. "If they believe someone matters to me," she said carefully, "they start paying attention to that person." Caleb looked toward the guard standing nearby, pretending not to listen. Then back at Lyra. "And that bothers you?" "Yes." "Why?" For several seconds, she said nothing. The station hummed softly around them while artificial rain began tapping against the glass dome overhead again. Finally, Lyra answered in a voice barely louder than the rain itself. "Because nobody has mattered to me in a very long time." The announcement arrived at exactly 0700 station time. Every screen across Helios. 9 flickered simultaneously before replacing advertisements and shipping schedules with a single silver emblem surrounded by rotating stars. Conversations stopped mid-sentence throughout the station. Cargo workers froze beside loading cranes. Merchants straightened their uniforms. Even the constant background noise of the station seemed to quiet beneath the cold authority carried by the symbol alone. Caleb was halfway inside a maintenance conduit when his wrist communicator crackled violently. Mercer, his supervisor, barked through static. "Where the hell are you?" Caleb pulled himself backward out of the narrow access shaft, wiping coolant residue from his jaw. "Currently being emotionally abused by Deck 4 wiring." "Forget the wiring. All non-essential maintenance crews are being cleared from the central transit sectors immediately." "Why?" Silence lingered just long enough to feel strange. Then his supervisor lowered his voice. "Because the matriarch is coming." Caleb frowned. "The what? You seriously do not know?" "I repair thermal regulators for a living, Frank." A deep metallic alarm suddenly rolled through the station, low and resonant enough to vibrate through the walls beneath Caleb's boots. Not an emergency signal. Something ceremonial. Outside the maintenance corridor, crowds were already moving rapidly toward the upper sectors. Caleb followed mostly because everybody else seemed terrified not to. By the time he reached the main observation concourse, Helios 9 no longer felt like itself. Armed security lined every corridor entrance wearing polished silver armor that reflected the station lights like mirrors. Entire sections of the station had been evacuated. Wealthy diplomats and academy officials stood silently along the massive glass promenade overlooking Docking Ring 1, all facing the same direction with rigid posture. Caleb spotted Lyra immediately near the front of the crowd. She wore dark formal clothing unlike anything he had seen her wear before, elegant silver patterns woven through black fabric that shimmered softly beneath the lights. Her silver-white hair was pulled back neatly, exposing the faint royal marking near her wrist. She looked breathtaking. She also looked nervous. The moment Lyra saw Caleb stepping into the concourse, genuine panic crossed her face. She moved toward him quickly through the silent crowd. "Why are you here?" she whispered urgently. Caleb blinked. "Pretty sure, because everybody evacuated my work area. You should leave. You keep saying that." Before she could answer, the entire station trembled beneath a deep mechanical roar. Outside the observation dome, an enormous vessel emerged from hyperspace directly. Beyond Helios 9. Caleb had seen military cruisers before during the border conflicts. This was different. The ship looked less like transportation and more like judgment given physical form. Black silver hull, endless rows of glowing windows, massive escort craft surrounding it like wolves guarding a queen. Every light inside the station dimmed automatically as the vessel approached the docking ring. Then something even stranger happened. The crowd knelt. Instantly, hundreds of people lowering themselves without hesitation across the entire concourse. Diplomats, officers, merchants, academy elites. Even station security dropped to one knee with heads bowed toward the approaching ship. Caleb remained standing simply because nobody had explained what was happening. Lyra stared at him in horror. "Caleb," the docking clamps thundered against the outer hull. A long silver bridge extended slowly from the ship toward the station entrance, while complete silence swallowed the concourse. Cold air rolled through the chamber as the massive doors opened. Figures emerged first in polished ceremonial armor carrying staffs lined with glowing symbols. Then finally, at the center of them all, came a woman whose presence changed the atmosphere of the entire station without a single word spoken. She was tall, graceful, impossibly composed. Deep sapphire skin, silver-white hair woven into intricate braids crowned with dark metallic rings. Her eyes moved across the kneeling crowd with calm authority sharpened by decades of absolute power. Caleb did not know who she was, but he understood immediately that everyone else feared her. The woman stepped forward slowly until her gaze landed on Lyra. Some of the coldness in her expression softened for a fraction of a second. Then her eyes shifted toward Caleb, still standing, every guard near the concourse visibly tensed. The woman studied him silently while the entire station seemed to stop breathing. Caleb glanced around at the kneeling crowd before looking back at her. Then, because apparently his survival instincts had abandoned him completely, he quietly asked Lyra under his breath, "Okay, who exactly is your grandmother?" The silence inside the concourse felt heavier than gravity itself. Hundreds of people remained kneeling beneath the cold silver lights of Helios 9 while the enormous diplomatic vessel loomed beyond the glass like a second moon. Caleb could hear the soft hiss of the station ventilation systems, the distant hum of docking clamps locking into place, even the faint rustle of ceremonial robes as the armored escorts shifted around the sapphire-skinned woman standing at the center of it all. Lyra looked seconds away from cardiac failure. "Caleb," she whispered urgently, "kneel." Caleb glanced around the concourse again. Everybody still had their heads lowered toward the woman near the docking bridge. Merchants, officers, security commanders. One elderly academy official looked physically ill watching Caleb remain upright. "Okay," Caleb muttered carefully. "In my defense, nobody explained the rules." The woman's silver eyes remained fixed on him. Calm, sharp, ancient somehow. She stepped forward once, and the entire atmosphere of the station seemed to tighten around the movement. "You do not recognize me," she observed. Her voice carried effortlessly across the silent concourse, smooth and controlled like polished steel. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "Not gonna lie, ma'am, I feel like this answer determines whether I survive the afternoon." Somewhere behind the matriarch, one of the armored escorts visibly stiffened in outrage. Lyra looked horrified enough to pass out. But then something unexpected happened. The older woman smiled. Barely. The expression lasted less than a second before disappearing again beneath regal composure, but Caleb caught it. "Interesting," she murmured softly. She turned her gaze briefly toward Lyra. "Rise, granddaughter." Lyra obeyed immediately, though her posture remained tense. Everyone else stayed kneeling. The imbalance made Caleb deeply uncomfortable. The matriarch studied Lyra for a long moment before speaking again. You have caused considerable concern. I apologize, grandmother. Do you? Lyra hesitated. No, she admitted quietly. Another tiny smile threatened the older woman's expression before vanishing again. Caleb watched the exchange carefully now. The fear surrounding this woman no longer confused him. Power radiated from her naturally, the way heat radiated from engines. But beneath it, hidden carefully beneath decades of control, he sensed something else too. Exhaustion. The matriarch finally looked back toward Caleb. You are the human maintenance worker. That is unfortunately correct. Caleb Mercer. The fact that she already knew his full name sent a cold ripple through his stomach. You have become important to my granddaughter. The entire concourse somehow became even quieter. Caleb glanced toward Lyra in surprise. She looked away immediately. I gave her half a sandwich, Caleb said carefully. I did not realize that carried political consequences. Several nearby guards looked moments away from fainting. But again, the matriarch's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not anger. Fascination. Most individuals who approach Lyra desire influence, wealth, or favor. Her silver eyes narrowed slightly. What do you desire from her? Caleb answered honestly because he had no idea what else to do. Mostly for her to stop skipping meals. Silence. Then one quiet sound escaped somewhere in the crowd behind them. A startled laugh quickly smothered into silence. Even Lyra stared at him in disbelief. The matriarch slowly descended the final step from the docking bridge until she stood directly in front of Caleb. Up close, she looked less like royalty and more like history itself given human form. You are either extremely brave, she said softly, or astonishingly foolish. Caleb considered that for a second. Can I choose both? For the first time, the woman smiled openly. It transformed her entire face. Not warmth exactly, but memory. Like she suddenly remembered what genuine conversation sounded like after years without hearing it. Then the smile faded once more into authority. Walk with me, Mr. Mercer. The words sent visible panic through half the station officials nearby. Lyra immediately stepped forward. Grandmother, you may join us. The matriarch turned smoothly toward the inner corridors of Helios. 9 while her escorts followed in absolute silence. Caleb stood frozen for half a second before leaning slightly toward Lyra. Quick question, he whispered carefully. How worried should I be right now? Lyra looked at him with equal parts fear and disbelief. Honestly, please. Very. The private transport chamber aboard the matriarch's vessel was quieter than any place Caleb had ever experienced. No advertisements. No crowd noise. No distant machinery rattling behind the walls. Just the soft hum of advanced engines vibrating beneath polished black floors smooth enough to reflect the silver lights overhead. Caleb sat stiffly inside a curved observation room large enough to fit his entire apartment twice over, trying very hard not to touch anything expensive. Across from him, Matriarch Seraphine Vale stood near the panoramic window overlooking Helios 9. The station drifted silently outside like a ring of gold suspended in endless darkness. Lyra remained beside the doorway, arms folded tightly across herself in visible tension. 2 armored guards waited outside the chamber entrance without moving. Caleb had seen statues with more personality. So, he said carefully into the silence, is this the part where I find out I accidentally insulted galactic royalty? Lyra closed her eyes briefly like she physically felt pain from hearing him speak. But Seraphine only continued watching the stars for several seconds before answering. You have no understanding of the systems surrounding my family, do you? Ma'am, until last week I thought the upper station districts were mostly accountants and rich students. A quiet sound escaped her. Not quite laughter. Close. Seraphine finally turned toward him fully. Up close, the precision of her appearance became almost intimidating. Every movement controlled, every expression measured. She looked like someone who had spent decades carrying entire civilizations on her shoulders and learned never to show the strain. The Veiled Dominion governs trade routes spanning 43 inhabited systems, she said calmly. Our fleets regulate commerce, security, diplomacy, and resource allocation throughout the outer systems. Caleb blinked once. That sounds exhausting. Lyra stared at him in disbelief. Seraphine's silver eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. Most individuals respond to that information with fear. Caleb shrugged lightly. Most individuals probably have better survival instincts. For the first time since entering the chamber, Lyra looked dangerously close to smiling. Seraphine noticed immediately. The older woman's expression changed almost invisibly at the sight. Softer, sadder somehow. She moved toward the long black table positioned at the center of the room. With a smooth gesture, she activated a holographic display. Financial records flooded the air in glowing silver streams. Property deeds, employment contracts, transfer authorizations. Numbers so large Caleb stopped trying to understand them halfway through. These assets, Seraphine said calmly, could be transferred into your ownership before the end of this conversation. Caleb stared at the holograms. Why? Because people rarely invest time in members of my family without expectation of reward. Lyra lowered her eyes immediately. There it was again. That quiet hurt she carried every time somebody treated kindness like strategy. Caleb leaned back slowly in his chair. You think I was trying to manipulate her? I think, Seraphine corrected carefully. That power attracts opportunists. Caleb glanced toward Lyra. She still could not look directly at him. That bothered him more than the impossible amount of money floating around the room. Can I say something honestly? He asked. Seraphine nodded once. I grew up on freight stations smaller than Helios 9. Spent most of my 20s fixing military transports during the border conflicts. You know what, people like me learn fast. Seraphine watched him silently. When somebody is lonely, Caleb continued quietly, you can tell almost immediately. Lyra's silver eyes lifted toward him at last. That first day near the observation dome, she looked like the only person in the entire station nobody actually saw. The chamber felt completely silent. Beyond the observation glass, stars drifted endlessly around the enormous vessel, while Helios 9 glowed faintly in the distance. Seraphine studied Caleb with an expression impossible to read now. No anger, no suspicion, something deeper, older. And the money? She asked softly. Caleb glanced again at the impossible holographic fortune floating above the table before shaking his head once. Ma'am, I repair coolant systems for a living. I literally brought her lunch in a scratched metal box. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then slowly, unexpectedly, Seraphine deactivated the holograms entirely. The silver light vanished from the room. Interesting, she murmured almost to herself. Lyra stared openly at her grandmother now, confusion replacing fear. Seraphine moved toward the observation glass once more, hands folded behind her back, while the stars reflected softly across her sapphire skin. Do you know, she said quietly, how long it has been since someone spoke to my granddaughter without wanting something in return? Caleb looked toward Lyra. Her eyes shimmered faintly beneath the silver lights. Too long, he answered. The emergency alarms began less than 10 minutes later. Sharp pulses of red light exploded across the observation chamber, while a low warning tone rolled through the matriarch's vessel hard enough to vibrate the floor beneath Caleb's boots. Every calm expression inside the room vanished instantly. The guards outside the chamber doors moved with frightening speed, hands pressing against glowing communication panels built into their armored wrists. Seraphine turned toward the ceiling displays as tactical projections burst into existence across the air in streams of crimson holographic text. Lyra's face lost all color. What happened? Caleb asked while standing abruptly from the table. One of the guards answered before Seraphine could. Unauthorized vessel breach near Helios, 9 central transit sectors. Another alarm echoed through the chamber. This one louder, more urgent. Outside the massive observation windows, Caleb could suddenly see movement around the station. Small dark ships weaving between docking rings far too fast for civilian traffic. Emergency shutters began sealing sections of Helios, 9 one by one like giant steel eyelids closing across the station. This is because of me, Lyra, whispered. Seraphine's silver eyes hardened instantly. No, but Caleb could already see the truth in the tactical displays flashing overhead. Somebody had timed this arrival carefully. Somebody knew exactly when the matriarch and her granddaughter would both be vulnerable in the same location. The ship trembled slightly beneath their feet as security vessels accelerated away from the flagship toward the station. A voice crackled across the chamber speakers in rapid alien dialect Caleb could not understand. Seraphine answered sharply in the same language before turning toward Lyra. "You will remain aboard this vessel." "Grandmother, that is not a request." Lyra stepped forward anyway, panic rising visibly beneath her controlled posture. "There are civilians still inside the transit sectors. Security forces are already responding. And if they fail?" Silence. Heavy silence. Caleb looked through the observation glass toward Helios 9. Somewhere inside that station were thousands of ordinary workers just trying to survive another shift. Maintenance crews, freight operators, families living contract to contract in steel corridors that smelled like machine oil and recycled air. His people. Then suddenly another warning tone erupted through the chamber. One of the holographic station schematics flashed bright red near docking ring 14. Caleb's stomach dropped instantly. "That sector controls auxiliary pressure gates," he muttered. Seraphine looked toward him sharply. "Explain." Caleb stepped closer to the display automatically, old maintenance instincts taking over before fear could. If those gates malfunctioned during an evacuation cycle, entire corridors could decompress. Another tremor rolled through the vessel. Not an impact. Something worse. System strain. Caleb recognized the vibration immediately. "They overloaded the station traffic grid," he said under his breath. "That is going to force emergency seal procedures." Lyra looked at him with widening eyes. People could become trapped between sections. Caleb nodded once, already calculating distances in his head. Access routes, pressure locks, manual override points. Seraphine studied him carefully. "Now, you understand Helios 9 systems intimately. I repair half the station personally because management refuses to replace anything older than me." Another red warning pulse flooded the chamber. Then suddenly, all station communications cut out entirely. Silence swallowed the room for half a second before backup emergency channels activated. One of the guards cursed softly in disbelief. Caleb was already moving toward the chamber exit. Lyra grabbed his arm immediately. "What are you doing? If those pressure gates lock incorrectly, civilians are going to get trapped inside transit tunnels. Security teams are handling it." Caleb looked toward the station again through the glass. His jaw tightened. Security teams do not know those systems like maintenance workers do. Lyra's grip tightened slightly around his sleeve. Fear filled her silver eyes now. Not political fear. Personal fear. "Caleb," he rested one hand gently over hers for just a second. Warm skin against trembling fingers beneath flashing red emergency lights. "Hey," he said softly. "Nobody is dying because a station built by idiots forgot how air works." Somehow that terrible joke almost made her cry. Seraphine watched the exchange in complete silence. Then finally, the matriarch spoke. "Escort Mr. Mercer to Helios 9 immediately." Lyra turned sharply toward her grandmother in shock. "You are allowing this?" Seraphine's silver eyes never left Caleb. "No," she answered quietly. "I am beginning to understand him." The shuttle ride back to Helios 9 lasted less than 4 minutes, but it felt longer. Emergency lights pulsed red across the compact transport cabin, while warning sirens echoed through the station outside, like distant thunder trapped inside steel walls. Caleb sat strapped into the jump seat nearest the hatch, one hand gripping the safety rail as the shuttle weaved between drifting cargo barges and security craft accelerating toward the upper docking rings. Across from him, Lyra had not spoken a single word since departure. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the glowing station ahead, where entire sections now flickered between power states as emergency bulkheads sealed throughout the transit sectors. Pressure readings are collapsing near Corridor 12. One armored pilot announced sharply through the cockpit speakers. Manual overrides are no longer responding. Caleb swore quietly under his breath. That corridor connects to the lower commuter tunnels. Lyra turned toward him immediately. "How many civilians?" "Night cycle." Caleb shook his head grimly. "Could be hundreds." The shuttle docked hard against an emergency airlock with enough force to rattle the cabin walls. The hatch opened instantly. Heat and noise slammed into them all at once. Helios 9 no longer sounded like a station. It sounded like a wounded machine trying desperately to keep itself alive. Alarms screamed through the corridors. Steam burst intermittently from overloaded vents. Workers and civilians hurried through flashing red passageways while security teams attempted to direct evacuations towards safer sectors. Caleb barely waited for the shuttle ramp to finish lowering before sprinting into the corridor. "Caleb," Lyra called after him. He turned just long enough to point toward a maintenance access junction farther down the hall. If the emergency gates seal completely, nobody inside Corridor 12 gets out. Then he disappeared into the station. The maintenance tunnels beneath Helios 9 were hotter than usual, thick with the metallic smell of overheating circuitry and leaking coolant. Caleb moved quickly through narrow service shafts barely lit by flickering emergency strips overhead. Every few seconds the station trembled around him as automated systems struggled to compensate for failing pressure zones. His wrist pad flashed warning after warning across the cracked display screen. Manual override failure. Auxiliary seal engaged. Structural stress detected. "Come on," Caleb muttered while climbing a vertical maintenance ladder 3 rungs at a time. "Do not die on me now." He reached the auxiliary pressure junction just as the first emergency gate began closing. Massive steel barriers descended slowly across the corridor entrance while frightened civilians hurried through the narrowing gap, carrying children, luggage, and whatever belongings they managed to grab. Before evacuation alarms triggered, Caleb's stomach dropped immediately. One side of the gate mechanism had jammed halfway through the seal cycle. The entire frame tilted crookedly against the track, metal grinding violently against metal. Sparks burst overhead. If the system locked unevenly, the pressure door would crush the escape route completely. People would become trapped on both sides. "Move," Caleb shouted toward the civilians still running through the corridor. "Keep moving." He dropped beside the exposed maintenance housing and tore open the access panel with both hands. Steam blasted across his face instantly. The manual hydraulic controls inside glowed dangerously red from overload. "Of course you are overheating," he hissed at the machinery. "Because apparently today hates me personally." The emergency gate groaned louder overhead. Its weight shifted violently against the broken track. Caleb looked up just in time to see the entire left support hinge buckle inward. If that hinge collapsed fully, the door would slam shut before the remaining civilians escaped. Without thinking, Caleb lunged forward and shoved both hands against the descending steel barrier. The impact nearly drove him to one knee. The pressure door was freezing cold from emergency seal systems, rough metal scraping against his burned palms while thousands of pounds of reinforced steel continued forcing downward inch by inch. Pain shot through his arms instantly, but the gate slowed. Behind him, terrified civilians rushed through the remaining gap while alarms screamed overhead. Caleb gritted his teeth harder and pushed back with everything he had left. "Move," he yelled again through clenched teeth. "Go." Somewhere beyond the corridor chaos, he heard another set of footsteps sprinting toward him. Then Lyra's voice cut through the alarms in sharp disbelief. "Caleb." He glanced toward her briefly, sweat running down his face beneath the flashing emergency lights. "Little busy right now," he strained out. Her silver eyes widened in horror as she realized what he was doing. The steel barrier trembled violently against his hands while the last civilians stumbled through the narrowing. Opening behind him, Caleb's arms shook from the pressure. Skin tore across his palms against frozen metal. But he did not let go, because somewhere during the past few weeks on Helios 9, this station full of strangers had quietly become his responsibility again. By the time the emergency finally ended, Helios 9 looked exhausted. Entire sections of the station remained dark beneath the artificial night cycle, while repair drones crawled slowly across damaged transit rails like glowing insects patching wounds. The sharp smell of burned circuitry still lingered through the lower sectors, mixing with steam rising from overloaded ventilation systems. But the pressure gates held. The civilians escaped. And somehow, against every statistical probability the station engineers kept repeating afterward, nobody died. Caleb spent the next 36 hours in a medical recovery room he repeatedly insisted he did not need. The medics ignored him completely, apparently becoming the human who physically held an emergency pressure barrier in place while civilians evacuated had stripped him of basic decision-making privileges. His palms were wrapped in silver regenerative bandages that glowed faintly beneath the soft hospital lighting. Every time he flexed his fingers, The skin burned sharply beneath the healing gel. "You are a terrible patient," Lyra observed quietly from the chair beside his bed. Caleb glanced up from the untouched bowl of synthetic soup sitting in front of him. "That is because your station coffee is somehow worse than the hospital food. This is not my station. Pretty sure your grandmother owns half the galaxy." Lyra lowered her eyes briefly, hiding a smile. Over the past 2 days, something subtle had changed between them. Not dramatic, not loud, just quieter, easier. Like all the fear and distance surrounding her had finally cracked open beneath those flashing emergency lights in Corridor 12. Caleb noticed she no longer sat several feet away during conversations, no longer guarded every expression like state secrets. She simply stayed beside him now. Outside the recovery room window, Helios 9 drifted peacefully against the stars while repair crews restored the final damaged sectors. The station looked small from up here, fragile. Caleb still could not believe people trusted places like this to hold entire lives together. A soft chime interrupted the silence. The medical room doors slid open smoothly, and matriarch Seraphine entered alone. No guards, no ceremony. For the first time since meeting her, she wore simple dark clothing without royal insignia or jeweled adornments. Somehow that made her presence even more powerful. Caleb started to sit upright automatically. Seraphine stopped him with a small gesture. "Please. The station medics already threaten legal action if you continue ignoring recovery instructions." Caleb blinked once. "I like them already." Lyra looked suspiciously close to laughing again. Seraphine approached the observation window slowly, hands folded behind her back, while starlight reflected softly across her sapphire skin. For several moments, she simply watched Helios 9 in silence. The civilians from Corridor 12 survived because the emergency gate remained open exactly 47 additional seconds, she said quietly. Long enough for every trapped individual to evacuate. Caleb shrugged carefully. Felt longer. Seraphine turned toward him then, her silver eyes calmer than he had ever seen them. "Most people spend their lives chasing power so they may protect themselves." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Lyra beside him. "You endangered yourself to protect strangers you would never meet again." Caleb looked down at the silver bandages wrapped around his hands. Somebody had to hold the gate. Silence settled softly through the recovery room after that. Peaceful silence this time. The kind that came after storms finally passed. Then, to Caleb's complete horror, Seraphine Vale lowered herself slowly onto one knee before his hospital bed. Lyra inhaled sharply in shock. Caleb nearly dropped his soup. "Absolutely not," he blurted instantly. "Please do not do that." But Seraphine only bowed her head slightly. "For generations, my family believed strength was measured through authority, control, and fear." Her voice remained calm and steady. "Then a maintenance worker carrying a metal lunchbox reminded my granddaughter what kindness feels like." Caleb had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. Seraphine finally rose smoothly back to her feet. Something warmer lingered in her expression now. Not political respect, personal gratitude. Before leaving, she reached into the pocket of her dark coat and placed a small wrapped package beside Caleb's untouched soup bowl. Then she quietly exited the room. Caleb frowned and picked it up carefully. Inside the wrapping paper sat a simple homemade sandwich. Turkey, apple slices on the side, cheap protein bar included. Exactly like the lunch he carried the day he first met Lyra. A small handwritten note rested beneath it in elegant silver ink. Caleb unfolded it slowly while Lyra watched beside him. The note contained only one sentence. "You once shared yours with her. I thought perhaps you should know what that kindness became." Caleb looked up toward the stars outside the recovery room window while Helios 9 drifted silently through the darkness. Beside him, Lyra rested her head lightly against his shoulder once more. And somewhere beyond the glass, entire fleets moved across the galaxy under the command of the most powerful family in the outer systems. Yet in that quiet little hospital room smelling faintly of medicine and machine oil, none of that power seemed nearly as important as a half-finished sandwich shared between two lonely people beside the stars.